Now, the public spending watchdog believes that Scotland's unlikely to meet its targets to reduce car use. Audit Scotland says car traffic has risen in the last 5 years, while public transport use has fallen, with little change in how much people are walking and cycling. It blames a lack of leadership from the Scottish Government. Well, Transport Scotland says there's still some way to go to transition from private vehicles towards more sustainable public transport. Here's Cornelius Chakwama from Audit Scotland.
What we found was at the ministerial level, a number of documents that should have given clear direction to councils and other partners on what they needed to do had not been approved for publication. So you see that challenge of leadership at the ministerial level. If you come down to government level, the cross-government working that we would have expected to see to drive forward, again, actions on this target haven't been visible.
Well, the government's connectivity minister, Jim Fairley, had this to say.
Everybody has got a responsibility here. We need to have these conversations both locally and nationally. Do we accept the fact that we want to get car emissions down? We want to do that because we've got a climate emergency. Does everybody accept that we've got that climate emergency, and how are we going to do this collectively? Now, we've put an awful lot of money into the public transport, as I said. We're investing over £2.6 billion in public transport. We've got £188.7 million for sustainable and active travel. We've got £54 million going into low carbon programmes such as ScotZED. So we're doing things.
Well, Ellie Harrison is the campaigner for better buses for Strathclyde. Afternoon to you, Ellie.
Hello there.
Well, you've just heard there the connectivity minister, Jim Fairley, claiming, among other things, that the government's putting in £2.6 billion into public transport. What's your response to that?
Well, I would agree with the gentleman from Audit Scotland that there is actually a complete lack of leadership in the Scottish Government and also a complete lack of urgency. So there was a Transport Act passed in 2019 which offered some new powers which would allow transport authorities to be able to bring bus networks back into public control. They're called franchising powers. And 5 years later, after that Act was passed, the powers in the Act have not finally been enacted. So transport authorities still can't use them. So we basically wasted 5 years since the Scottish Government set the target to reduce car miles by 20% by 2030, doing absolutely nothing to reform the way bus services are run, because we don't just need cheaper buses, we need much better public transport, which links up every single community across Scotland so that it is actually feasible for people to get around without owning cars. So we need integrated public transport, we need the buses that match up with the timetables, with the trains, with Subway in Glasgow city centre, with ferries, with other forms of transport, so that it all works together as one simple system.
Yeah, well, that
just
sounds
makes it easy for people to get around.
That sounds pretty common sense, but who effectively, whose responsibility is it to do that?
Well, we need the Scottish Government to enact these powers so that regional transport authorities like SPT in the Strathclyde region, Strathclyde Partnership for Transport, can use those powers. And if we look at what's happening in England at the moment, in Greater Manchester, they are leading the way. They began this process in 2017, and they've just completed the process of bringing the entire bus network across 10 local authorities back into public control. They've delivered a new integrated public transport system. It's called the B network, and it's one simple ticket for use across the bus, the tram network that they have there, and the trains will be brought into that in the next couple of years. And it's a £2 flat fare to get on any bus across those 10 local authorities. We need that kind of quality of service in every single region in Scotland, and we're only going to get that if these powers in the Transport Act for franchising are enacted, and the Scottish Government shows leadership and puts funding behind the powers which will enable transport authorities like SPT to get on and use them.
So when the Scottish Government, when Jim Fairley says that they're putting £2.6 billion into public transport, how much use is that if there's no sort of joined up thinking or plan for how that is spent? Is there any accountability for how that money is spent?
Well, the vast majority of that £2 billion is going to ScotRail, maintaining the Scottish Rail network, which is, of course, important, but it doesn't reach everybody. And that's the beauty of buses, that they have the potential to reach every community in Scotland. So they really need to refocus on bus services. They need to get on and enact the powers in the Act, which we've been waiting for 5 years. And we need to look at what Greater Manchester is doing. And it's not just them, it's Liverpool City Region, it's West Yorkshire, it's South Yorkshire, it's all of these city regions in the north of England are now moving ahead and re-regulating the bus networks, bringing them back into public control so that they can plan and coordinate the networks to work together, and they can regulate fares, because we have had since 1986 across the UK a completely deregulated bus network, and that's why we've seen the trends that we've seen over the last few decades, which is just less and less people using the bus because services get cut and the fares get hiked up and they're not regulated in the slightest, and we have to turn that around. So if the Scottish Government was serious, and I heard Jim Fairley on the radio this morning saying that he was interested in talking to passenger groups like us, well, that's interesting, because we wrote to him to ask him for a meeting before Christmas and he declined. We know exactly what needs to be done to sort out public transport networks across Scotland. We need to talk to him, and we need him to show leadership and actually enact the powers that will enable transport authorities to affect the change that we want to see and to fund them to be able to do that, because it's a small amount of funding in comparison to what they're spending on rail. It's about £100 million for Strathclyde to bring the bus network back into public control, which is a tiny fraction of that public transport budget, and it needs to be done.
All right, well, if you contact him again, he may well say yes this time if he is offering to meet with groups on Radio Scotland this morning. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Ellie Harrison there, campaigner for better buses for Strathclyde.